Here's the story of our recent trip to Germany, where we spent a lot of time at Luther sites and other related sites, and visited some Christmas markets as well. We started on the footsteps of Luther. Here you see his sign. And these are the main Luther sites that we visited: Wittenberg, Eisleben, Leipzig, the Wartburg Castle, and also Eisenach, Erfurt, sitting near there. Those were the main Luther sites we visited, and we visited a few other sites, other cities as well. Birthplace of Luther is a fairly substantial house in Eisleben, kind of a depressed town, a mining village, but there's no mining taking place there anymore. And this is the church of St. Peter and Paul in Eisleben, where Luther was baptized. Here's the interior of the church, and you see part of a large pool there, which is a baptismal pool that's primarily what the church is now used for. This is Luther's actual baptismal font. Unfortunately, this wasn't at the church at the time we were there, because it's in Minneapolis now, so we missed seeing it, but this is one I got off the internet. Here's Arden and some other folks. We were reflecting on our baptism and standing very close to the pool, so I've shown the pool here in this picture as well. Now, from Eisleben, Luther grew up in the town of Mansfield and then went to Eisenach for high school. Here you find yourself in Erfurt, which is the town where Luther went to university, originally to study law. But of course, the well-known story was he was frightened in a thunderstorm and promised to become a monk if he was saved. And in fact, he came back and stayed at the Augustinian Monastery here, preparing not only to be a monk, but also then eventually to be a priest. This is the cloister in the monastery, and it's a very beautiful building. Here's the interior of the church, the chapel of the monastery. You can see it's pretty simple. It has beautiful stained glass windows at the front, and one of the features that we noticed in the stained glass window that's on the far left was this particular seal right here. We noticed this seal was very similar to the Luther rose, and in fact we wonder if, as a monk, Luther hadn't stared at this seal and somehow absorbed this image and then took it on as his own in the Luther rose. In any event, Luther became a monk, lived and studied here in this monastery. Here we see part of the quarters. The monks slept on straw mattresses on the ground and wore, of course, these black cowl outfits. It was a very, very simple life. Of course, Erfurt itself was beautiful, and one of the things we saw there was the Christmas market. And here's one of probably the largest of these windmill kind of things that you see in Germany. Then, after studying for the priesthood, Luther ended up at Wittenberg, at the Castle Church, actually at the college there in Wittenberg. Here you see a picture of the map of Wittenberg, more or less showing you where the castle and Castle Church is, also the city church, the Church of St. Mary's, the college where Luther taught, his colleague Melanchthon's house, and further down the road was the monastery that originally was the Augustinian Monastery in town and later became Luther's house. Well, here's a view from the town square out toward the Castle Church. This is the town square that's in front of the city church, so you get some idea of the scope of things. Again, the Castle Church at night. This tower was built considerably after Luther's time, sometime in the 1800s. And in fact, on the top, you might be able to read part of a mighty fortress. There's another view of the tower of the Castle Church, along with some of the Christmas decorations in town. Now here's the famous door, well, actually a replica of it, containing the 95 Theses printed out. At the time of Luther, it was a wooden door, and the theses were allegedly nailed to the door. Here's the interior of the church. This shows the altar area, the pulpit, a little bit of a detail of the chancel itself, the altar itself, and statuary behind it. This is the pulpit from which Luther gave a good number of sermons, not all of his sermons in Wittenberg, but a good number of them there, primarily to the students in the college who he was teaching. And below this, you see just down below and to the right is Luther's grave. In fact, here's Martin Luther's grave closer up. He is buried there in the church. But interesting also is his friend Philip Melanchthon, his colleague. They were both extremely highly thought of. Of course, there are statues in there, statues showing Martin Luther, showing Melanchthon. Also other people, colleagues. This is Johannes Bugenhagen, who was, in fact, Luther's preacher. He was the pastor of the city church and also Luther's confessor, and a colleague in doing a lot of the work at the college, as well as doing translation of the Bible. Another man was George Spalatin, who was the vicar to the elector Frederick. We'll talk a little bit more about Frederick later, but Spalatin played an important role as the go-between between Luther and Frederick on many, many occasions. Now, here's the city church, the Church of St. Mary's. It has an interesting story about the towers on the top. After the time of Luther, but not too long after, was the time when, in fact, the city of Wittenberg was actually attacked by Charles V and his soldiers. And in fact, they removed the steeples from these towers and placed cannons up on the top. The steeples were not replaced in exactly the same way, but were still replaced at some point in the future. This is the interior of the church, and you'll notice several very interesting features. Here on the right is the pulpit from which Luther preached. Directly in front, in the chancel area, well, right before the chancel area, is a baptismal font. We'll come back to that and talk about that in a moment. And further up, you see a spectacular altarpiece by Lucas Cranach the Elder. We'll take a closer look at each of these pieces. Luther gave thousands of sermons, primarily from this church. Again, this was the church of the people of the town, and so he looked on them as his parishioners and spoke to them in his sermons. The baptismal font is, in fact, very, very large. It's made of copper. You notice the pew behind it and several feet behind it. You can get some idea of the scale of this, but it was a large enough font that, in fact, the babies could be dunked down into the font. So it wasn't just sprinkling water. It was actually baptism by immersion. And one of the stories was that under the old regime, the priests had just put cold water in this pan, water that they'd drawn out of the well right outside the church, and dunked the babies into it. And of course, the babies were screaming and shivering. And as the monks and priests became married and learned a little bit more about family life, they decided that it was a pretty cruel thing to do, to dunk babies in this ice-cold water. So they got into the habit of putting the water in early in order to let it warm up. But even more, they put hot stones inside the water to really warm it so the babies wouldn't be so discomforted. That sounds like an interesting story. I hope it's true. And this is the altarpiece by Cranach. It was painted in actually 1547, after the time of Luther, just barely after his death. And there are really 4 panels in it. The 3 across the top talk about at the time, the sacraments that Luther portrayed, and the bottom is more or less a preaching. Let's take a look at these. The leftmost one on the top shows the sacrament of baptism. And here you can see again the relative size of the baptismal font as it's depicted here. And as you zoom in on that baby, you can see that the baby is actually dripping. People in the picture are sort of interesting. I can't really identify any of them, except for the woman whose back is to us. That, it turns out, was Cranach's wife, and he couldn't bring himself to paint her picture face on because she was not of noble heritage. Only the nobles allegedly were painted face on. The second picture shows the Lord's Supper, the Eucharist. And here it shows the disciples sitting around the table having dinner, what looks to be a goat or a lamb in the center of the table. And you might be able to pick out several of the disciples here. One in particular, if you zoom in on the man who is just in the foreground to Christ's right, you see he's licking the finger of Christ. But if you look for a moment, you'll notice that there's something in his left hand. And in fact, if you look closely, you'll see it's a sack of silver coins. And that is presumably Judas. So in fact, it's kind of an interesting picture of Judas. It might also very well be that castle in the background might be the Wartburg. We'll see how much it looks like the Wartburg when we come up to that a little bit later. The third is really what's called in the Lutheran heritage the office of the keys or confession. And here you see the priest with the man here on the left who is penitent is forgiving the man. The man on the right, who was in fact not penitent, might have even been trying to either threaten or buy his forgiveness, and the priest is sending him away with his arms bound together. So there's some message there about confession or the office of the keys. Finally, the bottom panel shows Luther preaching to the congregation, and the image of Christ in the center would indicate that Christ was always the focus of Luther's preaching. Again, an interesting person here. On the far right, or far left rather, the woman with the sort of light blue gown is probably Katie Luther. She could be shown face on because in fact she was noble. Well, there's something that's fairly disturbing also in this church, and this is high up on the church in the back. It's a carving, and it is basically an anti-Semitic carving. It shows a pig, and it shows Jewish children or babies suckling at the pig, and it shows a rabbi looking in the pig's anus. So it really was a very hateful symbol. This really predated Luther, but it also shows the attitudes of the time of Luther and, in fact, for time thereafter, and may help to understand some of Luther's more horrible writings against the Jews. Well, as we walked through town, we came to the current site of Wittenberg College, and this may have been where the college was located, or at least some of its buildings. We also came to the building that was, in fact, originally the Augustinian Monastery, and that later became Luther's house, where he and Katie and their family, and of course many, many visitors, students, and so forth, lived. Here's a statue of Katie, showing her to be a very active person, and you can see that her finger is rubbed for good luck by many folks. Here we sit at the seat where allegedly Luther and Katie would sit in the evening to discuss the day's affairs. Now, we met many interesting people on our way, and this is Philip Melanchthon, who was Luther's colleague, in many respects as fine, and in some respects a better scholar even than Luther. Melanchthon was a scholar of Greek and of theology, and in fact it was Melanchthon who wrote this, what is the first Protestant theological book written in 1521. This is a systematic theology of what Luther, Melanchthon, and their colleagues were teaching only 4 years after the nailing of the theses. Here's another of Melanchthon's writings. He gathered together a lot of what was believed, what the beliefs were, and in 1530 they had a discussion with the Catholics in the city of Augsburg, and this is called the Augsburg Confession. This was the confession of the Protestant churches at the time. This man is also very important in the era, but he's not a theologian. This is Lucas Cranach, the painter. Actually, Cranach the Elder, and this is an older picture of him. He painted many portraits. Here, a younger Luther. Here, an older Luther. And you can see that Luther has fleshed out a bit in this older picture. This is a picture of Luther, Katie von Bora. And here are pictures of Luther's parents, Hans and Margaret, his father and mother. Here's a picture of Luther and his friend Melanchthon. You can see that Melanchthon is several years younger than Luther, and in fact lived quite a while and influenced things quite a while after Luther's death. Now this man is Frederick the Wise, and he is very important to Luther because he was one of the 7 electors of the emperor, of the Holy Roman Emperor. And as such, he was not only a prince in the region, but also a very important person even internationally. He was the elector from Saxony, the area of Wittenberg and a lot of the other areas where Luther lived and visited. And he was more or less a sponsor of the university in Wittenberg. He created the university and hired Luther and other theologians to come in and teach. He also changed and himself came to more Protestant views, and he and his brother who ruled after him, and then his son who ruled after his brother, were all big supporters of Luther. Well, here you see the Christmas market at Wittenberg. Again, a small Christmas market. This wasn't a very large one, but very festive with rides and with lots of booths selling food, drink, and little trinkets. Another interesting site, and this is a more modern site, an arboretum just outside, just kind of off the main street of town, and it contains 500 trees that were planted in honor of the 500th anniversary in, of course, this current year. And you see, this is tree number 84 that was sent by the Indiana-Kentucky Synod of the ELCA. And here are our friends Lisa and Ted Miller standing by the Synod tree. Well, our next stop will be the Wartburg. And I've kind of illustrated on this map what Luther's travels were. If you see between Wittenberg and Worms, we didn't visit Worms, but that was the place Luther had to go to defend himself against the Catholic Church and against the Emperor, Charles V. That's a distance probably of about 250 miles. And really, except for a trip to Rome, Luther made very few other trips outside of that cluster of yellow pins right there in the center, and of course on to Worms. It was after Worms he was guaranteed free passage back, and on the way back he was captured by friends and taken to the Wartburg. The Wartburg is right outside Eisenach, the place where Luther had gone to high school, so kind of in the center of this map. And this shows the castle. When we were there, it was a very a very cloudy and frosty day. You can see the frost on the trees. Here's the main gate to the castle. And walking through that gate, you have to pass into the inner castle. So there's a second gate that you pass through to get into the inner castle. And inside that inner castle is the area where Luther's study was. That teardrop-shaped room there was the room of Luther's study. Now here's the passageway, a kind of romantic passageway from the inner castle to that room, and here's the room itself. You can see, of course, the fireplace there that was used to keep the room warm, to heat it, the paneling on the wall, the desk at which Luther worked to translate the New Testament into German. And there on the wall, you see the picture of Knight George. This was Luther's disguise while he was at the Wartburg for about the 10 months or so that he was there. So after the Wartburg, Luther came back to Wittenberg and resumed his career there. Luther himself went to Leipzig. You can see, again, Leipzig is again in the center, but didn't spend a great deal of time there, but we spent time in Leipzig and it was delightful. This is the Thomaskirche in Leipzig, perhaps best known as the church where Johann Sebastian Bach was the cantor and choir director, musician, where he wrote most of his cantatas and other major works. And while we were there, we were fortunate to hear a a series of works by the boys' choir. It was all sung from this balcony area. And as we turned around, you could see the chancel area. And there in the foreground is Bach's grave. So that's where Bach was buried. And in fact, one of the main reasons we were in Leipzig. Now, another interesting place we visited in Leipzig was the St. Nicholas Church. And this was a place that, in addition to its beauty, if you notice these beautiful columns with the kind of natural motifs on the top, this was a place where in the late 80s, this was a center for the silent revolution, the place from which that revolution kind of sprung out and moved out and disarmed the communist government, so to speak, to the extent that eventually the wall was broken and the government fell. A very interesting site in Leipzig. Well, as in other places, we visited the Christmas market, and here's probably the largest of these candle arches that we found. What we learned about these was the miners would build arches, of course nowhere near this size, mostly they just go in windows and hold candles, but they would build these arches over the winter time when they weren't mining, and they would make them basically in the shape of the entrance to the mine. So that's why they are this arch. And then they had figures inside, frequently creche scenes, but this one seems to have some toy soldiers. One of the stops along the ways was Lubeck, way up north. Lubeck is on the Baltic, and we made a special trip up here to visit Christmas markets and to see this church, the Lubeck Cathedral. A very interesting, very large red brick cathedral. It was instrumental in developing Lutheranism in the north. And in fact, Bugenhagen was the man who came up here into this part of Germany and helped to bring pastors and create the Lutheran or the evangelical churches in the north of Germany. The interior of the church is really quite simple. It is a beautiful church, but in a very stark way. You notice there are not a lot of stained glass because the windows were destroyed during the Second World War and really hadn't been reconstructed. The church is also important because the organist, the famous, worked here at the time when Bach was a young man. And the story, of course, was that Bach came to hear and meet Buxtehude and had thought about succeeding him, and in order to do so might have had to marry Buxtehude's daughter, but that didn't work out, and so Bach went to other venues for his work. Well, here's a site of, again, the Christmas market. This shows kind of how crowded these Christmas markets frequently are. Lots of booths, one right after another, and lots of folks at them. Another city that we visited is Dresden, and this by itself wasn't so much a Luther city. I don't even know if Luther came here. It's really very much more a Roman Catholic city, but it is the site of a beautiful Lutheran cathedral called the Frauenkirche. Here you see our friends, the Millers and Sue, standing in front of the Luther on the plaza before the church. And the church is very different from so many of the other churches that we've been in. This one is very much more kind of a Baroque or Rococo style church, and especially as you see the inside. The front altar piece is spectacular. The church painting is beautiful pastels, and the dome above is an absolutely gorgeous thing to view. Well, here we also had lots of good eats in the Christmas market in Dresden. Here you see some sausages being grilled over a grill by some good men. We both began and ended our trip in Berlin. And Luther, to my knowledge, didn't go to Berlin, but we did. And one of the sites there is the Berlin Dome. Now, this was much newer than the other churches that we visited. This probably was built in the mid or late 19th century, and it's kind of a Baroque architecture inside as well. You see the angels up there on top and a large amount of gilt. And again, what's interesting about this church is it has a lot of interesting carvings and statues. I'm not even showing you all of them, but here's a picture of Luther having a disputation with one of the Catholic priests or bishops. Here it shows, in addition to, of course, the standard statues of Luther and Melanchthon, there were also statues of Frederick the Wise of Saxony, who protected Luther. And important to Berlin was Joachim II, who was the Elector of Brandenburg, the region right around and including Berlin. And he was the one who more or less protected the Protestants in the Berlin area and fostered the growth of Protestantism there. Well, this pretty well ends our visit to these Luther sites. Here's the Christmas market in Berlin.